Hello and welcome to Capital Insight. I'm State Representative Kevin Mannix from Salem, and I'm your host for this program, which is designed to give all of us a little more insight into the personalities and characters involved in and around government, and some insight into how government actually operates and affects our citizens. Our guests today are two gentlemen who are very heavily involved in planning, but in a different sense, the Capital Planning Commission. We have Doug Capps, who is the Executive Director of the Capital Planning Commission, and Carl Myers, who is the Chair of the Capital Planning Commission. Welcome to Capital Insight.
Nice to have us.
Good, thanks.
Well, I'm happy to have you here because although I'm a member of the Capital Planning Commission, I'm also aware that the public doesn't really know what you're all about or what we are all about. And Carl, from the beginning here, I'd like to get some idea of you as a person, and we try to present that too. Where do you come from?
Well, I grew up in Salem, Kevin. I graduated from South High 30 years ago. We had our 30th anniversary this summer. Went away to school to the University of Oregon in Eugene, and spent some time in the service and finished my law school career in Eugene. Came back 20 years ago, almost to the day, and opened up my law practice here in Salem. So I've got family I've been around Salem all my life.
Now, in your current practice, you're a government relations consultant and an attorney in private practice. Tell us a little bit about how that works.
I have a general practice and have been in practice since, as I said, for 20 years. In the last 10 years or so, I have found my practice gravitating to representing individuals in government agencies and representing organizations at the legislature or in front of government agencies.
Now, as a separate matter, then, as a citizen, you've been appointed to the Capital Planning Commission, and you're now chair. Now, people would wonder, is this a half-time job, full-time job? Are you paid for this? Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, service on the Capital Planning Commission is really volunteer work. It's public service work. We don't get paid as such for the work that we do. 8 or 10 years ago, Neil Goldschmidt appointed me to serve on the Capital Planning Commission. Basically as the public representative from the city of Salem. As you may well know, the Capital Planning Commission is made up of a number of different people, but 3 are from the public sector citizens. Generally 1 from the Salem area, 1 from Portland, and generally 1 from Eugene or outside the Portland-Salem area, and I happen to represent the citizens of Salem in the Capital Planning Commission.
Now, what drew you into the practice of law and then this public service?
It goes back a long time. My grandfather was involved in both politics and public service in Salem for years. My family's been around Salem. In fact, my mother went to high school here, and my dad grew up in Scotts Mills, not far from here. So my family goes back years in the Salem area, and public service has always been a part of that. My grandfather, before he came back to Oregon, was a judge. And so I sort of got interested in the law from my grandfather, and I've always been interested in helping folks, and the law seemed to be a natural way for me to help people resolve problems or avoid problems, and so going to law school was sort of a natural for me. But public service has been in the family for years, and if it hadn't been the Capital Planning Commission that had come along, it would have been something else.
Well, Doug, you've been patiently listening here as I extracted this information from Carl.
I learned some things. Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, there's some real similarities, I guess, in the experience that Carl and I have had too. I too am an attorney. I'm a little older than Carl. I graduated from Northwestern School of Law at Lewis and Clark in '73. Got my passage into the Oregon State Bar and practiced law for a couple of years. But my background is more as a professional, more on the public side, not as a practicing attorney, but I was hired as the executive assistant to Neil Goldschmidt when he was mayor of Portland, and had some involvement and experience with the city of Portland, and was attracted to that. So I left my private practice for a bit, kind of on the assumption, I guess, that I would go back to it, but got fairly involved in a number of issues in the Portland area that the city was then involved in, and was recruited to TriMet, the transit agency in Portland, to serve in a variety of capacities. I was there for 15 years. Began my service there partly using my legal experience. There was a small legal department that needed to be managed better and set up better and so forth. The agency was expanding pretty dramatically, but also a lot of internal administrative things that had to be attended to and dealt with and so forth. And I took my city administrative experience to the transit agency to assist with that.
Now, at some point, you became a member of the Capital Planning Commission as opposed to executive director.
I did, and you know, Neil's name has been mentioned maybe too many times on this program already, but having had the close personal relationship with Neil and his family, when Neil was elected as governor, and at that time, or shortly thereafter, Mahonia Hall was acquired as the governor's residence. And I think there was a sense on the part of the governor's family that there might be a interesting, that maybe almost a friend of the family should be part of the introduction of the first family into this new residence with some protection. And interestingly enough, Mahonia Hall falls under the jurisdiction of the Capital Planning Commission. And I was asked to join the commission then originally for that specific purpose, just to assist with the transition of that house as a state asset and to assure that a number of objectives and interests were met. But you know, obviously I think that the connection was beyond the personal friendship connection because of my legal background in land use and planning, having had a significant amount of experience at TriMet with land use planning and service planning in the Portland area.
Well, you've sort of applied all of it then as a member of the commission, and ultimately, was it 2 years ago now that you were actually selected as executive director by the commission?
That's
I know
right.
you recused yourself from that process, and we selected you from among a number of candidates. What does the executive director do?
Well, the job of the executive director, you know, the Capital Planning Commission has a rather interesting authority and has exercised that authority over a number of years since 1949, and it would seem as if the commission is maybe a rather large entity. In fact, there are only two of us.
And you're talking about the staff.
The staff I'm talking about. The commission itself has 9 members that meets on a fairly regular basis. So my job is to keep track of the capital projects that are occurring, that are being generated by the state in this area. And our jurisdictional area is Marion and Polk County. And also to assess the impact of those projects, capital projects, buildings or modifications to buildings and facilities and so forth, to measure those or test those against adopted plans that have been adopted by the Capital Planning Commission.
Now, you're working then as the chief cook and bottle washer from a staff perspective and run the organization on a daily basis. Then you have a chair of the Capital Planning Commission. Carl, how does your role fit in here?
Well, the chair's main responsibility is to organize and to run the meetings. I work closely with Doug in setting the agenda and making sure that the issues that are ripe for our discussion get on the agenda, and that the behind-the-scenes work gets coordinated. But as a volunteer myself, I don't have the luxury of being able to spend a lot of time with it, so we have to rely on staff to coordinate the efforts and make sure the materials get out to not only the commission but to the interested parties in any of our projects or agenda items. I'm fortunate to have Doug and Ellen Russell, who works with us. They put in long and hard hours to make sure that those of us who only show up a couple hours a month for meetings are well educated in the issues and are able then to exercise our vote in the commission to make sure that the things get done right.
Now, this brings up the question that, gee, there isn't a lot of construction going on right now. You don't see a lot of big buildings going up around the Capitol these days. Why do we need a Capital Planning Commission right now? And in fact, there was a proposal back in the '93 session to just abolish the Capital Planning Commission. You want to offer some insight on
Sure.
that, Doug?
There's some, I think it's an appropriate question. There has been, I think, an assumption that the greatest utility of the Capital Planning Commission is when the state is growing and booming and building more and more facilities and having a greater and greater impact on the local community. And that certainly is true. What we're finding is, particularly with the impact of Measure 5 and the reduction of capital dollars to build facilities, that state agencies are finding other ways to manage their facilities. In some cases, they are taking out long-term leases in private facilities. And the Commission's view of that is, well, that is virtually tantamount to a state agency really owning that property. If they're going to be to have the same impacts on a neighborhood or a community as they might if they were to own the building, well, then those kinds of decisions also require review. In addition to that, there is a kind of an ebb and flow in the work of the Commission, which allows us to devote more attention when there are fewer projects, to devote time to updating and revising the area plans that are the responsibility of the Capital Planning Commission to administer.
The thought occurs to me, if you analogize this to, say, a Coast Guard rescue crew stationed somewhere, they're not out there all the time on rescue missions, but in between they've got to be planning ahead for how they're going to handle it, make sure the boat is secure, in good shape, and whatever else. It would seem to me, if anything, this lull between bursts of construction activity is a good time to talk about the future and plan for the future and not be surprised by it. Is that how you see this, Carl?
Well, that's true, Kevin. There was a period of time when I first came on the Commission that there were buildings being built all around the mall, and it seemed that the Capital Planning Commission, all they could do was react to these various projects. We now have some time to take a look at what the future of the state grounds in the Marion and Polk County areas really is, and we've been able to do some planning. One of the projects that you were involved in was that North Mall project, where we've actually been able to sit down and take a look at the area between Summer and Winter Street at the north end of the mall, and really get government and the neighborhoods to sit down and try to decide what is the best use of that, coordinating the need for state offices and yet the community's need for some open spaces and a more livability factor in that area. I anticipate that the Capital Planning Commission will be taking a look at some other areas. We're looking right now at the state hospital grounds and the state penitentiary grounds in that area to take that on as our next project and help the state and the local community plan for that area. There are some other areas. The Fairview area south of town is one that we need to look at. The airport area around there is another area that we need to take a look at and make sure that the state is using those for their best use and in conjunction with the needs of the community.
Well, as we look at that, I suppose, too, we can put this into some context. The Capital Planning Commission has some unusual membership, too. I'm a state representative. I'm a member representing the House of Representatives. Senator Gene Derfler is a member representing the Senate. And as I understand the history, going back to 1949, the Commission was set up to sort of make sure that the policymakers in the Capitol, House and the Senate, were involved with the executive branch, who are also represented on the Commission, but then make sure you have interaction with the city and the county to make sure that this big state government, that when it's making decisions in this community, that we're bringing people together. It sounds like, Carl, that the North Mall Task Force is an example of how that was a win-win for everybody. I mean, the legislators want to make sure that when construction projects are presented, that we're not having to deal with fighting groups, but that people have come together. The executive branch wants to be able to plan for construction in the future, know that they've got some places where they can put buildings, but the city wants to worry about transit, wants to worry about traffic, about the neighborhoods, and the same concerns from the neighborhood association. Would that almost be the best example of how the Commission can come together and bring to fruition a plan that everybody says, hey, that's a good idea?
I think so. I think it's probably the best example of how government can work to coordinate the interests of a diverse population. As with any situation, not everybody comes away 100% happy. It's not necessarily a compromise, but it is a melding of ideas and positions. I was very proud of the task force. They were able to put aside their individual differences or individual agendas, if you will, and come up with something that was in the best interests of everyone. There are a few people on both sides of the issue I'm sure would have wanted more towards what they wanted as opposed to what the final result was. But I think overall the neighborhoods have been happy, state government has been happy. I think the community has been well served by that effort because it really was a coming together of folks with a unified interest to do what's best. And
we're going to pause for a moment, but I'm going to ask you to give me a little bit of detail on what that North Mall plan is all about. I'll mention to our audience, though, that you're with us on Capitol Insight. I'm State Representative Kevin Mannix from Salem, and I'm your host. Our guests today are two gentlemen from the Capital Planning Commission, the chair of the commission, Carl Myers, and the executive director, Doug Capps. And we'll carry on from there. We were just talking about the North Mall, and can you describe, perhaps, Doug, about, sure. We had historical houses there, we had a neighborhood that was worried, and Carl mentioned about the impact of state building, and then you had a creek running through there. Mm-hmm. What did we end up with as a proposal for that area?
Ended up with, I think, a really happy conclusion that really does reflect the interests of a number of parties. One is there will be land preserved for the development of state government offices. Now that's a little touchy to talk about these days because not very many people, I guess, in the public are that anxious to see government expand. But we know as capital planners that growth is probably going to occur as the population in the state increases. Greater resources needed for the expansion of a variety of essential state functions. And that being the case, the state really needs to have some kind of an idea of what space is available to it in the Capitol Mall area to accomplish that. But at the same time, and I've said this to a number of people, I wished we'd thought about this earlier. There are a number of very fine historic homes in that area, and there is an interest in assuring that as government expands, particularly in a community like Salem, where there are houses and neighborhoods adjacent to government offices, that those neighborhood interests are protected as well. So the end result was to preserve an area for the expansion of state offices, but also to preserve some of the homes that remain there that are state-owned, and to create a open space park-like environment for the citizens of this community to be able to enjoy the space around there, and incidentally, to turn the use of those houses over to productive, economically productive use, so that the state can be, in a public-private partnership, can be receiving some kind of revenue from those facilities as well.
Well, let's talk then about something that was controversial that had more negative PR, and that's the Archives building. And people would probably say, well, what did the Capital Planning Commission have to do, and why didn't you do something about the interior contents, the complaints about it being too fancy and sumptuous and all that stuff? Carl, how would you respond to that sort of thing?
Well, I don't want to sound glib or avoiding it, but the interior of the building really is not within our jurisdiction, nor is funding. The cost of the building really is, we have not been given any legislative jurisdiction over, and to a large extent the cost of the carpet, various accoutrements, furniture, etc., is really not within our purview. We are charged to make sure that the exterior of the building fits within the surroundings, is compatible with the neighborhoods, that transportation issues, parking issues, and other usability issues are considered. But the interior kinds of things that were controversial with the Archives building really were not ours to judge.
And in fact, as you mentioned those things, the things that the Commission did have jurisdiction over were not controversial. The neighborhood was worked with as to the specific location of the building. The city was worked with in regard to traffic patterns. And yes, the building fits in with what we'll call the monumental style of Capitol Mall buildings. So it's helpful to bring out the distinction that the things that were within the purview of the commission were not controversial.
Well,
things for which there was no overview process, and there still isn't.
That's
the
right.
interior
Yeah.
contents, other than
Yeah.
whatever administrative procedures happen, those are the things that push some hot buttons.
Well, and I think a good example of that was the original design of that building and its location on that site. Had it located very close to D Street, which would have been smack dab in front of a row of houses that, as far as anybody can tell, are probably going to be there for a good long while. They're sound houses in a very attractive neighborhood. And the end result of the Capital Planning Commission's review of that was to situate that building further away from D Street to provide more of a buffer so that it wasn't, so that compatibility with the neighborhood could be assured.
Now, what about the future of the Capital Planning Commission? As I pose that question, I guess I'll pause for another moment and turn to our audience and say that you are with us on Capital Insight. I'm your host, Kevin Mannix. If you ever have any questions or concerns, I hope you feel free to write to me at Capital Insight, H395, State Capitol, Salem, Oregon, 97310. Again, that's Capital Insight, H395, State Capitol, Salem, Oregon, 97310. And if you would write with any comments, questions, or concerns, I'll be happy to respond. But picking up with our guests, Carl Myers and Doug Capps of Capital Planning Commission, talking about the future and projects that you would identify. Carl, what do you see as, you've mentioned the state hospital grounds and the state penitentiary, what are some of the areas of concern for the next couple of years for the Capital Planning Commission?
Well, I think one of the issues that I think we need to tackle, and the Capital Planning Commission is probably the appropriate agency to do that, is to get an inventory of state lands in this area, and perhaps even statewide, and then serve as a coordinator amongst the various state agencies to make sure that the state lands that we do have are being utilized and appropriately utilized. I think the state government is not much different than any homeowner, and it's cheaper for state government to own a building than to rent it. Even at an attractive long-term lease, the benefits are the same for the state. And so rather than have state offices spread all over, if they can be appropriately situated on the state lands that we own, I think that's in everybody's best interest. One of the nice things, of course, is that all of us that serve on the Capital Planning Commission come in as taxpayers as well as everyone else. So we bring that perspective to all of our work, and one of the things we want to do is to make sure that the lands that are owned by the state are used appropriately. Again, coordinating the interests of the state and the interests of the surrounding community.
Doug, did you want to add something to that in terms of the next couple of years and projections and plans?
Well, not anything of any different in nature, but to reinforce what Carl has said, we're spending some time now with several state agencies and trying to identify a site for an emergency management, a joint facility with emergency management and state police dispatch and military department. And in the course of doing that, took a tour on several occasions around the Salem area to identify available land, to do that state-owned available land. And it's only when you have an experience like that that you realize how much land the state actually owns. Now, I'm sure there's a good reason for that. Historically, there have been good reasons for that, and most of these lands are attached to significant existing facilities, whether it's Hillcrest or the state penitentiary or whatever. But it does cause one to ask the question, are those lands being put to the most productive use? Does the state have a plan for the future of those lands? Is there any possibility that Hillcrest and Fairview are going to expand to those hundreds of acres around them? Even the state penitentiary, which has had sort of a buffer zone around it probably for security reasons or whatever, is it appropriate to perhaps, if state facilities are going to consolidate and be more productive and newer facilities and so forth, is it appropriate to use that land for that purpose. So we're probably a little less involved in the state construction business like we were at the end of the 80s and early 90s when there were significant funds available, but we're certainly much more involved in long-range planning.
Well, you've raised an interesting question, because it would seem that, let's face it, agencies are run by human beings. Human beings have a tendency to be possessive. And would it be that some agencies would just as soon not be reviewing their properties too carefully in terms of saying, well, we ought to dispose of these properties, because the properties are generally held in the name of a given agency,
That's
aren't
right.
they?
That's right. No, and I think it is human nature, and it's very, I don't think, in some cases, I think it's just a question of nobody has asked the question. You know, what is your long-range plan? As you know, we're embarking on a joint study of the state hospital and state penitentiary grounds and facilities. If you talk to the folks at the state hospital who have many responsibilities and things to worry about, one of the things they probably have not worried about lately is the utilization of some of those facilities at the state hospital, and that really, they need to be encouraged, and that is the charge to the Capital Planning Commission, is to analyze and to invoke longer range planning by state agencies so that the use of those facilities and the use of that property is more productive.
Carl, do you see yourself as being in the role of an advocate for a lot of this as chair of the commission? I mean, you have to deal with the legislature when you come in for funding and present the Capital Planning Commission, but how do you see your role in terms of dealing with the agencies on this?
I think the Capital Planning Commission really is a catalyst for the discussion. We need to I don't want to say force, but encourage the state agencies to take a look down the line. As Doug was talking about this, I envisioned all of us probably have an attic or a garage someplace where we have things that we just are sure we're going to need at some point down the line, and probably have been unused for the last decade, and that's probably a similar situation with a lot of these agencies. But if they're being forced in a coordinated way with other agencies, none of this can be done agency by agency, because one agency may decide that they don't need that property and sell it when there is another agency down the street who could use a piece of property but doesn't have it. And I think one of the worst things we could do is start selling off this excess land without a thought to what we might need in the future, because it's certainly going to be more expensive to buy it 10 years down the line than it is to hold it now. We just need to make sure that everybody is around a table talking about what they're going to be doing next month, what they're going to be doing next year, and what they're going to be doing 5 and 10 years down the line, and quite honestly, as far out into the future as we can force them to look. We're not going to know, of course, what the size of state government is going to be or what kinds of things are going to happen, but I think we can, as much as humanly possible, look at the future and coordinate efforts to get rid of that is not going to be useful now or in the future, and keep and better manage that we have and are going to keep.
Well, it sounds like your dynamic then truly is planning.
That's what our name implies.
But we're not like your typical city planning commission where you have people coming in all the time just with proposals. You're there trying to stimulate the discussion.
Yeah,
too.
exactly. You know, there's a very interesting evolution if you look back at with the formation of the Capital Planning Commission in 1949, and even now in the statute there is reference to preserving property for future state use. Well, of course, that was all created around the new Capitol building, which had been built at that time.
I'm going to have to interrupt you and mention that we have to preserve our 30-minute time limit, too. Thank you both for joining us.
Thank you.
And thank you to our audience. Thanks for joining us on Capital Insight.